Alrighty, so in this video we're going to now show a technique for perfecting how our game objects are positioned in the world when we don't have access to actually modify the meshes themselves. So we see that there's a problem usually with these taller buildings, but it's actually a problem with both the missiles and the buildings. Their pivot points aren't set appropriately. Now I can show you guys visually what I mean by that by jumping over into our scratch scene and bringing over one of our basic missile prefabs. If I bring this guy over and I position him at 0, 0, 0, he gets positioned over here. Now, if I go into Game Object, Create Other, and I create a sphere, and I position my sphere at 0, 0, 0, you'll notice that by positioning both these objects at the same location, they actually appear to be in different places. So, this is problematic. The way we can fix this is by looking at the child of our basic missile prefab and setting him up in a way that he's directly on top of this sphere. In fact, he's centered on the sphere. So I'm going to go ahead and use these orthogonal views, or not orthogonal views, but snapping to these axes to make sure that we are getting pretty dead on center with the sphere. Now, it's important to understand that I just did that with the child of Basic Missile. Basic Missile itself is still positioned at 0, 0, 0, but the mesh is now positioned in these coordinates that give it the effect of being centered on the pivot point that we want. The final thing I need to do is I need to perform that same operation with my collider, because now the collider is wrong. So that's very easy to do. I can just go over here into my collider options and I can move them around so that they're set up properly. So I can come down here in the y-axis and I can move back a little bit with... Actually, it looks like... Right, because I centered, 0, 0, 0. Actually, we can do a little bit better by moving it back a little bit.
So basically what we're saying is our mesh thinks 0, 0, 0 is in one spot, but it's wrong. And so we're just telling it to adjust what the mesh thinks by X amount because we can't fix the mesh.
Right. So this technique allows us to get our meshes set up properly. So now I'm going to go back to Basic Missile. I'm going to hit Apply. After hitting Apply, I'm going to go back to my level 1 and hit Play. And let's see how much closer our missiles now get to our buildings. As you can see, it's already looking way better. Now we have a problem with the straight up and down, and it looks like those are having some problems too. But that's because the buildings need to be modified in the same way that our missile was just changed. So to do that, let's jump back into our scratch level and perform the same operation on our building 1 and our building 2. So I'm going to delete both of these game objects because I no longer need them. I'm not going to be messing with them anymore. And I'm going to move over a building 1. And I'm going to set it at 0, 0, 0. Then I'm going to create a sphere, set it at 0, 0, 0, and then I'm going to make it so that they are basically on the same point. Now the problem with this is that our mesh filter is actually, and our mesh render, is our children, or not children, but components attached to the primary game object. I actually don't want that. The way that this technique works is that the mesh filter and mesh render need to be on a different game object that we can then move around with its own unique transform. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove the mesh render and I'm going to remove the mesh filter. Then I'm going to create a new empty game object and place it on building 1, and I'm going to name it mesh. Mesh is going to be positioned at 0, 0, 0, and it's going to be a child of building 1. In addition, I'm going to set his scale, reset his scale to 1, 1, 1. Now, I'm going to add a mesh filter, and I'm going to point the mesh filter at building 1. After I have the mesh filter, I'm going to add a mesh renderer, and I'm going to set the mesh renderer's material to building 1. Now you'll notice we've effectively made it look like just like it did before.
Just the way it was before, yeah.
The difference is we can now move our fancy new game object, child game object, right onto the sphere, like so. So that looks pretty good.
Yeah.
Next up, I want to do the same thing to the collider. Now the collider is still attached to building 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it over. Well, looks like we can just go ahead and use, because we've offsetted everything correct. Oops, Unity is messing up here.
Oh dear. Oh, there it goes.
No, it's not letting me type in a number.
Oh.
That's fine, I don't need to. I can just drag it a little bit. Because that's pretty dead on right there. And I think that pretty much completes that. The final thing I need to do is I need to move the progress bar to the middle, which is surprisingly just 0. And now I have a building 1. So now I'm going to hit apply.
So essentially, to fix the pivot point, you fixed everything else instead of the pivot point.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and do the same thing to building 2 just to recap our steps. This is really good practice for working with Unity, by the way.
Especially if you're working with people that are not on the same site. You could easily be in a position where you don't have access to a 3D modeler to repair things.
Right.
Or know how to.
So here I'm going to set the same thing. I'm going to set it up to 0, 0, 0 so I can see the discrepancy between where I want it to go and where it is. So I'm going to remove my mesh renderer from the main component. I'm also going to remove my mesh filter. I'm going to remove my animator, but I'm going to leave my targetable and my box collider on the main component. Next up, I'm going to create an empty game object. I'm going to call it mesh, and I'm going to child it to building 2. Now this step is incredibly important. I'm going to zero out its transform. Now remember, whenever I say zero out its transform, I mean setting position and rotational to 0, but scale to 1. That's because 1 is the identity of a multiplication operation, whereas addition is obviously 0. We don't want it to multiply the scale down to 0.
To 0, yeah.
Yeah, then it won't exist. So now I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to set it to building 2. Then I'm going to add a renderer. Whoops, I don't want a cloth renderer. Oh, come on. Adding a cloth render, like added a cloth render and an interactive cloth. Then I want a mesh render. And then I'm going to set the mesh render's material to building 2. Then I'm simply going to compensate for the difference between the pivot point I want and the pivot point that we have, and I get that. The next step is I'm going to make our box collider fit in on our building, which just means moving it like that. Finally, I want to change my progress bar's position to 0 because now everything is properly aligned. Now that's not exactly perfect. We could move our mesh a little bit to the right. Let's go into an orthographic view and see. There we go. And then we can go ahead and make sure that comes over just a little bit to 0 about. And that means we're pretty dead on. Let's make sure our other axes are correct. And they are.
Pretty good.
Okay, so now I can go back to building 2 and hit apply. Now when I go back into level and hit play, we should see our missiles hitting our targets properly. As you see, they are incredibly accurate now. The only ones that are missing are ones with buildings that were destroyed after those objects got launched. However, we did just see a bug here. One of the missiles was trying to hit this guy, but it hit this guy instead, and it didn't apply damage to this guy. that bug is actually caused by the fact that whenever we hit anything that isn't our target, we just blow up the missile and don't actually give it damage.
We didn't give it any other options.
Right. So let's go back into our code and do one little change. I'm going to say if trigger, I'm going to say var target hit equals trigger collider dot game object dot get component targetable. Now, this will return null if the game object we hit doesn't have the targetable component. So now we can say if target hit equals null, destroy ourselves and return. Otherwise, tell the target we hit to take damage, not the target we initially decided on. Now that we've done that and actually simplified our code a little bit, we should see that our missiles, even if they hit the thing they weren't intending to, as long as it's a building, it'll still apply damage to it. So we can see that right here, where I believe those were going for this guy, or at least one of them was, and it gave damage to that. Alrighty. So I think that wraps up that little issue. I hope you guys learned a little bit about pivot points and how to compensate for them in Unity. And we'll see you in the next video.